Good afternoon and welcome to the MIT Alumni Career Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Ellen Stahl and I am the MIT Alumni Career Counselor and will serve as host and moderator for today's workshop. This webinar is being broadcast live and we will be collecting questions from you throughout the presentation. Please type your questions in the chat box on the lower right side of the WebEx window. The questions you type will not be seen by the audience and will only be seen by me, so confidentiality can be respected. Also, please know you are all muted and can only ask a question via the chat box. Our topic today is career transition to a startup. Evaluate if it's right for you. Leading and managing an engineering team at a startup can be a thrilling and challenging experience. Before jumping into an engineering leadership role, it is critical to understand the phases of startup growth, how the startup experience differs from that of an established company, and how job roles differ. In this webinar, we'll explore each of these, as well as present tools to help you assess whether transitioning to a startup is right for you. Before we begin, I want to introduce you to our presenter today, Jonathan Levene. Jonathan, a Course 6 alumnus, is a Boston-based executive and career coach, specializing in engineering leadership and career development. He provides management training and coaching for leading innovation teams more effectively and making successful engineering career transitions. He is a 14-year veteran of product development, organizations, and high-tech startups, and is the CEO of his own high-tech venture. Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. I hand it over to you.
The agenda for today, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself for context. We'll talk a little bit about why make a move to a startup. What are some of the reasons that people do it? We'll also talk a little bit about the startup phase that companies pass through to make it really clear what we mean by startups in this context. Different roles and mindsets that successful engineering leaders in startups have. And then the meat of our conversation here will be how to go about evaluating whether the move is right for you. So I'll be describing some personality, some behavioral self-assessments that can be helpful. We'll talk a little bit about how to engage other people to learn from their experience. And we'll end with a few more resources for you. This slide deck I'll be distributing after the webinar, so there's no need to take notes. And we really will welcome any questions you have. So as Ellen pointed out, there's a Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner. So please, as we move through, send us your questions. And we'll either be covering them towards the end of the webinar, or if they're appropriate to what we're discussing, we'll pause and answer some of those then. So as Ellen pointed out, I'm an executive and career coach. I specialize in engineering leadership and career development. I'm based here in Boston. And I help engineering executives and mid-level managers to lead teams that are innovating in one way or another more effectively by communicating better, influencing their peers and senior leaders better, building more effective teams, and managing change as it occurs. I also spend a lot of time with clients helping them make successful career transitions. My background, as Ellen pointed out, I've worked in startups for 15 years in just about every corporate function. I did leave MIT in Course 6 and did a couple degrees in 97 and 98, founded my own software venture, ran that. And in addition to serving in an engineering function, I've also done product management, sales and marketing, and a little bit of finance as well. So why make a move to a startup? I'm a big fan of Tom Fishburne's cartoons called Brain Camp, and hopefully this resonates with some of you. You know, working in a large company, when you've got an existing product, many of us can feel like there's too many obstacles to moving forward and innovating. That slows us down, that can be frustrating. If you're working at a larger company on a new product, sometimes it can feel like, you know, when you've got a creative, innovative idea, that there's just a lot of people just waiting to cut it down, hack it down, kind of modify it, and that can also be a source of frustration. Either of those can often lead people to seek out a more stimulating, free, and creative career by working for smaller companies. Many of you may also be considering starting up your own venture as well. So any questions that come up related to that, I'll do my best to answer those as well. Let's talk a little bit about what exactly we mean by startup for the purposes of this webinar, and some of the roles and successful mindsets that engineering leaders adopt. So in the life cycle of a startup, if you think of a startup as just a little seedling that eventually, if successful, grows to quite a large forest, you can consider 4 different stages in the growth of companies. The first, customer validation, is when the company works towards getting a very first customer to commit and purchase a product or service. Operational validation is when you try to standardize the processes that you use to deliver the products, to acquire new customers, to satisfy those customers and administer the rest of the business. Financial validation comes later, where essentially you're trying to consistently deliver value to customers as the company grows at scale and govern the business by those processes that you set up in the prior stage. And then lastly, self-sustainability involves launching innovative new products to keep the business fresh and alive. So for our purposes, what I mean by startup is a company that is still working on that customer validation phase and has got right up to the point where they've got their first 1, 2, or 3 official customers. So many of you, having been in engineering for a while, are familiar with the variety of roles. Here's a very simple way of defining a little bit the way that those roles often manifest in smaller companies. And so it's, although job titles tend to mean very little in small companies, and responsibilities do differ a fair bit, it can be helpful just to review, at least a common understanding for companies under 10 people. So what I'm about to explain really is only valid for very, very small startups. In general, I should say, before we go much further, if you consider making a move to a startup, it's really important to clarify with whoever your boss would be, well, what exactly would be the scope of my responsibilities? Because it does differ a great deal. But that being said, there is a certain amount of consensus. So I'll just step through the obvious roles here. CTO is typically the strongest technologist in the organization, and he or she will be a seasoned architect, a thinker, a researcher, a tester, or a tinkerer. They won't be big on process typically. They're often the technical co-founder, if there is one. The chief architect is a title often used by a technical co-founder as well, with similar responsibilities as the CTO, but they may be a little bit younger, and they may have fewer technical chops. And so he or she collaborates more closely with the development team, and so they're subject to a little bit more process typically as they work with their colleagues. The VP of engineering is ideally a great manager. They're a great team builder, a recruiter, a communicator, and they, above all else, they resolve issues. They remove the obstacles that hinder people. And so they're essentially a people person with some important technical skill, but typically less than a chief architect or CTO. So their job in general is to make everyone in the engineering organization successful and remove the obstacles that are hindering them. And if you're familiar with the program manager position, that's there just for context. So regardless of whatever role that entrepreneurial leaders, particularly those in engineering, take, to be successful in a startup, it requires 7 very different ways of thinking and working and engaging people compared to large companies. So just to go over those briefly, in a small company, you're shaping culture much more than you would at a large company. You're defining the norms, you're articulating a vision, you're realizing the values that are important to the company. And because it's so small, you have a much greater ability to shape that. It's also really critical to be able to embrace the uncertainty that comes with working on a small venture. And that means taking action when there's a lot of unknowns. It means adapting to what may feel like unfamiliar tasks, and then tolerating a certain amount of imperfection or even failure. So those of us with high standards, that can be a challenge. Learning happens differently in small companies. It's usually via experimentation. So often startups create experiments to test hypotheses. They need to learn or know when is good enough. When have we learned enough? When is the product good enough? When have we got enough customer feedback? And they need to be able to learn on the fly and act with sometimes little planning. Accepting change is sort of integral to the startup experience because you're going through so much change. What that means in practice is, for example, you may need to have a preference, particularly for really, really early stage companies, a preference for projects over process. That means little standardization may exist. It's also important to be open to pivoting when required. So that may mean abandoning projects, abandoning tasks if new information comes in about a direction that the company needs to go. It also may mean changing the composition of teams depending on the need of the project, and even changing roles. So for those of us that have worked in large established companies where there are, really high walls set up in between projects or between teams or functions, those typically come down, and it's really important to be able to approach each project or task differently and look at what's needed rather than the way things are traditionally done. It's also important to be able to execute creatively. What I mean by that is not expecting that you'll be able to resource a project or even a team like you would in a larger company, but rather have a kind of lean and scrappy way of moving forward. So that may mean being willing to beg, borrow, and steal. It may mean being very frugal and squeezing every ounce out of every person hour or every dollar that you've got access to. It may require some creative thinking outside the box about how you can actually move forward given time constraints or resource constraints. Motivation is often a skill that is overlooked with startups. Often a misunderstanding with startups is that simply giving somebody equity is the only way of motivating them. With startups, it's more critical to motivate people than ever. It's more critical to empower them, to read their needs, and to show directly how the work that they're doing links directly to a vision for the company, for the product, so that they feel connected to what they're doing and the work is important. It goes without saying that when the tech labor market is as tight as it is now, no startup can afford to lose anybody, and certainly the amount of energy and effort it takes to get good talent warrants keeping people once you've got them. Lastly, the way power flows through an organization is very different. Typically in large companies, power tends to flow vertically through org charts, through command and control structures, but in a very flat in a very flat startup organization where there isn't very much hierarchy, it's more important to be able to influence your peers, because your peers are really primarily a source for your power as an individual, as a manager, rather than your power through the org chart. So what that means in practice is developing the skill to find common ground when you're trying to convince people. It's crucial to win their trust and support, and building relationships is something that every entrepreneurial leader, every engineering leader needs to be able to do well, and to a much greater extent than they might in a large company.
I just want to remind folks that you're welcome to type questions into the lower right-hand section of the webinar. There's a box there for questions. Those will come to me confidentially, and we will share them with the group when appropriate.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears now and take a look at how might you evaluate whether a move to a startup is right for you. There are some great tools for getting a sense of fit between your personality or your behavior and that of most entrepreneurial leaders, and that's what we're going to go into next. So just a few disclaimers I want to point out first. So the tools I'm about to share with you, the intent here is for you to use these tools to see where your strengths and weaknesses lie. There is no such thing as an item in one of these assessments that's always good or always bad. It depends on what the startup environment requires. It depends on what an individual company requires. And overlaying what you learn through these assessments to a particular situation is the way to figure out whether that's helpful or not. As I tell all my clients, treat the indicators that you get from these assessments as just that, as indicators rather than a litmus test. In other words, it's not a cut and dried answer about whether you are the right person for a startup. There may be certain areas where you have strengths that will be really helpful for working in the startup environment. There may be some areas where you have some weaknesses for a particular situation, but weaknesses can be developed and even strengths can be overused. So this is not meant to be a final assessment. It's meant to be the starting point for where you want to go from here and the starting point for a plan for your own career development. I should also point out that these kinds of self-assessments, it's an industry that makes a significant amount of money. So I'm not compensated in any way for promoting these. I'm just trying to be as helpful as I can. So the first assessment that I point out here, called Myers-Briggs or MBTI, if you've never had it done, it essentially tries to assess inborn personality preferences using 4 dichotomies or axes. One, extroversion or introversion. This is where you focus your attention and where you get energy, whether you get energy by engaging others or whether you get energy through solitary activities, reading and writing or thinking. Another dimension here for personality, according to the MBTI, is what they call sensing and intuition. So these are 2 opposite ways in which you may take in information about the world and the kind of information you like and trust. So people who are big on sensing, they tend to see a lot of details and they live through experiencing and really being able to touch and smell and feel those details. People who are big on the intuition side, they tend not to see the details first. They tend to see patterns first, and they tend to see meaning first, after which details may emerge. Another dimension, thinking or feeling, this describes the way you make decisions. So thinkers tend to be very objective in how they go about decision making. Feelers tend to be very values-based, and they think about the way that a decision impacts people rather than, what is right with capital R. The last dichotomy here is what's called judging versus perceiving. So these are 2 opposite ways of how you might engage the external world and how you might orient yourself to it. So people who are big on judging, and note, judging doesn't mean judgmental. It's not a negative term like that. But people who are big on judging, it's important to them to structure their work. They're big planners. They're very organized, and they engage the outside world in a very controlled way. People who are big on perceiving tend to live in the present, and they tend to relish creating options rather than making decisions that would close them off. And there are equally appropriate ways for startups, as we'll talk about. Startups may, if you want to be successful, require that you think or behave a little bit differently than your natural predisposition. So there's no good or bad type per se, but it all depends on whether the type that MBTI says you have is a good fit for a particular startup that you're looking for.
I just want to chime in as a big fan of the Myers-Briggs, just to reiterate that it's not that you have one or the other. It really is on a continuum, and it's all about preferences. If you had a choice, how are you apt to do something, think about something, make a decision about something. It's, again, if you had a choice to do it. So it's sort of that tapping into that shoes-off self. If you were sitting around with your best friends and you could make a decision about something or think about something, again, it's not that you're not intuitive or you're not a sensor. It's about what preferences you have in terms of the way that your dichotomy is presented.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ellen. And you know, the Myers-Briggs often uses handwriting as an example. If you're, let's say you're right-handed, it's more natural to write with your right hand. You can still write with your left hand. It just takes a little more concentration and focus. So one thing that was kind of interesting I wanted to point out, in 1991, there was an MIT study of 73 technical entrepreneurs. And the study tried to correlate, well, what MBTI profile for each of these 73 people is most highly correlated with entrepreneurial success. And that was ENTP. So each of those letters corresponds to, you know, one of the four dichotomies and where those people ended up. So the E, it stands for extroversion, N stands for intuition, T stands for thinking, and P stands for perceiving. It's not surprising that the middle two letters, NT, are there because most of us engineers are intuitive and we decide by thinking. Some of you may find extroversion and perceiving to be challenging. So extroversion, it really helps if you get energy when you're working with others, when you're interacting with them. Relationship building is really important when you're working on a small, tight-knit team. And for the reason why perceiving, I think, is there, if you think about it, there's much less opportunity to plan. Very small companies need to pivot and react and respond to new data coming in. And that means they have less opportunity to structure their work around them than they might if they were much larger. So you can discover your MBTI profile at one site that I'm a big fan of. If you haven't done it here before, is called Type Coach. So if you go to type-coach.com, you complete a series of questions. They've got some great videos that explain a little bit more about each of these four dichotomies. The cost is $55, and that includes a report of the findings for you as well. Another good assessment is called Entrepreneurial Strengths Finder. This is actually run by the Gallup organization that typically does polling. They studied 2,500 entrepreneurs to try to understand the 10 skills, behaviors, and traits that most correlate to small business success. And they created this Entrepreneurial Strengths Finder assessment so that when you take it, you get assessed along each of these 10 skills, behaviors, and traits. So what they are here, I'll quickly run through them. One is called business focus. That means your ability to make decisions based on what you observe around you and in the field, in the marketplace, and be able to anticipate the effect of those observations on profit. Confidence, so accurately knowing yourself, understanding others. Creative thinking, exhibiting creativity in how you go about taking an existing idea or product and turning it into something better. Delegation, so recognizing that you can't do everything yourself and be willing to contemplate a shift in style and control of your work. Determination, so they mean persevering through difficult or insurmountable obstacles. Independence, being able to do whatever's needed to build a successful venture and to be able to run with those tasks. Knowledge seeking, so constantly searching for the information you need that's relevant to the problem or the challenge that you have. And then promotion, and by this they mean being the spokesperson for your business or your product. Relationship building is developing relationships with your peers and others in the company. And then lastly, being able and willing to take risks effectively. Working for a startup is really about placing the best bets that you can. So you can take the Entrepreneurial Strengths Finder. If you go to this website, gallupstrengthcenter.com/ESF, you'll complete a series of questions. They charge $12, and they also provide a report with some recommendations for you. Another new assessment that just came out this year, actually, it's called Foresight. It's an assessment that measures how you approach innovative projects, and it assesses your preferences, your preferred way of working, of being at work, along 4 different dimensions. Each of these, combine in all of us, but you may know some people that perhaps one of these 4 really stands out or is really obvious. So the first of these 4 dimensions they call clarifying. So people who are high in the clarifying dimension, they like to spend time getting a really, really clear understanding of a challenge or issue before, jumping into ideas or solutions or actions. So they're relatively cautious, but they make sure that the right challenge is being addressed. The next dimension they call ideating. So people who are high in ideating, they like to generate broad concepts and ideas. They typically are visionaries. They're most comfortable understanding a big picture, stretching their imagination. People who are high in the developing dimension here, they like to spend time analyzing possible solutions, breaking them apart, examining their strengths and weaknesses, and they get really excited when they transform, a rough idea into a finely crafted solution and thinking through all the different steps necessary to implement it. And lastly, people who are high in what they call implementing, they strive constantly to take action on ideas, and they derive the most energy from bringing ideas to fruition and seeing tangible outcomes from them. So I just want to stress that at different phases of company growth and perhaps for different projects, some of these preferences may be needed more than others. And if you've been working in a large company for a while, you probably know that in general, if you have one team that's innovating on new or existing products, you really want to have a good, healthy mix of all of those 4 preferences. So you can help take a project from slideware to working beta right through to maturity. Now, in startups in general, ideating and implementing tend to be more highly valued than clarifying and developing. There just isn't really a lot of time to get very clear on for instance, all the requirements and what would constitute success for a product. Developing sometimes is also something that's time constrained. So really, you've got typically in startups at least one, maybe more visionaries that are the source of ideas, and then there need to be a lot of people surrounding them that can really be effective at helping to translate those ideas into reality. That's what the people who are high in implementing can do. So you can go to foresightonline.com. The cost of taking the assessment is $35, and it also includes a report with some recommendations.
And also, Jonathan, I'd like to add that what's so, I think, helpful about the self-assessment piece is not only to be using it to learn if a startup is right for you or if a particular organization is right for you, but really to get such a good, clear understanding of yourself and how you can use the tools of self-assessment to talk about who you are, why you would be a good fit, the way that you think and problem solve about issues. It can really give individuals a good vocabulary in which to use to really get down to the nitty-gritty of the pieces that the self-assessment really sort of brings to the surface.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alan. So one other type of assessment that I recommend is I call a reflection exercise. This is something you can do on your own. Take a few minutes and just think of 2 or 3 of your favorite projects from the recent past, which you either led or participated in, and pick the ones that you really felt the most energized by, that you wish you could replicate in some way. And then ask yourself a few questions. So how many of the 7 startup mindsets that I've discussed did this project require you to adopt? So in particular, did you need to be explicit about building a vision for success on this project? How necessary was it for you to embrace uncertainty, to learn by experimenting, to be responsive to change and accept it when it occurred, be very scrappy in terms of how you resource the project, and did you have to motivate others in some explicit way, and how important was peer influence on the project? So once you have these mindsets and projects in mind, for these mindsets that you did adopt, what was it like for you? What was easy? What was hard? What did you learn about yourself in the process? So we've talked so far about a few sort of standardized assessments you can take that are mostly online. I just described a kind of reflection exercise that's from your own past. Another great source of information to help you consider what it might be like to make a move is to learn from others. And so, speaking to others about their experience, people who've gone through a similar transition is a wonderful way to learn and to stimulate some thinking on your end. So typically to do this, you want to, first decide, well, what is the role that I'm interested in? And then go about using that as a guide to pick people with the same role so that you get the most relevant answers for you. If you're a little unclear which role you're most interested in, just take a look at some job descriptions that are out there and just see what resonates with you. What is it that you read that turns you on? Why do you think that that's so exciting? And sometimes that can be a great way to just discover what's right up your alley. If you could speak to somebody who'd done exactly what you're considering doing, what questions would you ask them? What are you curious about? What are you concerned about? Take a moment to write those down as you begin this process of talking to people.
Can I put in a plug here, Jonathan?
Of course.
So as alums, you obviously have access to the online alumni directory, of which there are over 100,000 alums in that system. Also, there's a sub-part of that is called ICANN, and those are alums who have virtually raised their hands, offering to help current students or fellow alumni in career transitions or learning information about their company or their particular sector. And those folks are definitely a good place to start if you are not necessarily happy about having to do any sort of networking. I know that it is not a thing that most people like to do, but it really is a critical component to developing professional goals for yourself. So I would definitely suggest if anybody has any questions about the ICANN or how to use it or how best to search it, feel free to contact me, and I would be happy to go through that with you.
Great. So once you're clear on the kind of role that you're considering or that you're most interested in, and you've identified a few people, and we can talk a little bit more about how to find the people. Typically you can engage them in one of two ways. You can do an informational interview, which is typically done by phone, and contact them over email, set up a time, and call them and prepare for that. Or you can engage them in person, and that's typically done at a networking event. And both of them are equally appropriate ways to have conversations about their own experience. You may find it easier to start by phone, simply because, for many people and engineers in particular, I know, speaking personally, networking, it can be a little challenging. So let's talk about how to do this by phone. So first, you want to start by picking some companies. You want to build a list of companies that interest you. So here's some ideas. Google for venture capital firms in your area. Most of them on their website list the companies that are in their portfolio. So you can read about companies and discover them that way. You can also Google for incubators. If you're not familiar with those, these are sort of one-stop service providers for startups. And find some in your area, similar to venture capital firms. They have often a list of portfolio companies on their website. You can read about them as well. If you live near a big academic research institution like MIT or in North Carolina, Research Triangle Park and so forth, maybe Stanford and so forth on the West Coast, you can read about their recent spin-offs, typically through their website or in the news. LinkedIn also allows you to search for companies by size, which is really useful. Another one is Crunchbase. If you've never used Crunchbase.com, they're like a big database for funding activity. And so you can search for recent rounds of funding, whether it's a round of seed capital or a Series A round of capital, and a date range, and they'll list out all the companies that did successfully close the round. Lastly, you can read articles in online startup publications. So Xconomy and TechCrunch are good ones that I like. There's also local city business journals. So like here in Boston, we have the Boston Business Journal. The company that runs the Boston Business Journal is called American City Business Journals, and they run them in just about every major city in the U.S. They often provide startup coverage just as part of their general tech and finance coverage. So the next thing to do is to find people that you want to interview at those companies. So once you've got that list of companies, go to their websites, and typically, they've got a list of their leadership team. You can read their bios. As Ellen pointed out, MIT's alumni database is a terrific resource. There's just thousands and thousands of people in there, many of which are happy to speak to you. You can also use LinkedIn. So in addition to searching for companies, you can also put in criteria like, keywords for job titles, and they'll pull up candidates that way. Finding their email address can be a little tricky. Typically, an easy way to handle this is to guess their email address or different variations of it from the website domain, and then common email address formats. So typically, you might come up with 3 or 4 different guest email addresses, knowing their first and last name and the website domain. And then what I like to do is, pick one of those and send that in the to field in your email, and then put the rest as BCCs. So that way, you know that if one of those email addresses is correct, you'll have exactly one email that will get through that person. You're not going to spam them. You may get some bounces, but they'll never be the wiser. So email them, ask them for a 20-minute informational interview. And if you've never done that before, informational interview, it's kind of a code. It means I don't want to ask you for anything big. I just want to pick your brain. And what can be surprising is people expect this. People are often very happy to have informational interviews because they know that no one's going to be making a big ask. And as long as you don't make a big ask, as long as you're just asking them for their experience or their thoughts, generally, I find people are very happy to spend 15, 20 minutes just talking with you. Here's some tips for the interview when you do it. So first, before you actually call them, learn a little bit about the company and the person. So read their bio, visit the company, get at least a sense about what the company does. I recommend that you prepare a script the first few times you do this. Write out your questions, but don't feel like you have to stick to the script. You can use it as a fallback, but let the conversation evolve. So in your script, start by just telling them a little bit about yourself. Give just a 1-minute bio of your interests and what you've done over your career. Explain to them, what you're hoping to learn. So share some of the questions that you had, some of your concerns, things you're curious about. Be very, very clear what you want to ask them. So generally I find, if there's two things that tend to take an informational interview south. It's when somebody makes a big ask, so if you don't do that, you're fine. And secondly, if you've got the other person on the phone, but you're not very clear exactly what questions you wanted to ask. As long as you've got both of those in line, it's going to go great. Keep the call to 20 to 30 minutes to be respectful of their time, and thank them again for their time at the end. And a good best practice at the end is always ask them, who else do you think I should speak to, given what I'm trying to accomplish? And very often, people will, help connect you with another 2 or 3 people that will then make it just a little bit easier next time. So once more, when you're preparing for this call and you have a list of questions, think of some questions that would get at your concern. So if you're, say, concerned about the risks of working for a startup because it's so small and there isn't that stability, ask them, well, how much risk do you perceive at your company? How do you manage that? What do you do about that? So networking conversations, if you do choose to engage people live, which is the most effective way to do it, one easy way to do it is to find startup events near you and to go to those and try to engage technical entrepreneurs in casual conversation. So you could find events like this on meetup.com. You can Google for hackathons. If you've never attended those, they're just a ton of fun, and you meet a lot of interesting people. You can also learn about startup networking events or pitch events near you. So Venture Fizz is a great place to go for discovering events like that. If you've gone to a networking event that's just a big room full of people, it can be intimidating for many of us to just go and introduce ourselves and just start talking to people we don't know. So a great thing to do, if that's been your experience, is go to a structured networking event. So this is like a networking event where there's an activity that makes it more easy and actually a lot more fun just to engage people because you're talking with them about whatever the activity is or the material that's being presented. So a hackathon, that's typically the way it's structured as well. Before you go, sometimes you can find a list of registered attendees, the people who've registered, and you may get, like if you do the registration to Eventbrite, for example, as one registration company, you can sometimes get the names, companies, and job titles of attendees as they register. So take a few minutes before you go just to take a look at that list and get a sense of who's going to be there. And that way, when you meet people, you'll remember the fact that you read a little bit about them, and that will just help make the conversation flow a bit more easy, and it'll make it a bit more comfortable to reach out to them. Just like on the phone-based informational interviews, come with a few questions so that when you're chatting with them, you can pull those out and say, look, I've been thinking about moving to a startup, and there are a few questions I had for you. Would you mind just chatting with me for a minute? And again, this is why people go to networking events, so they're typically happy to talk with you. So as we wrap up here, a few additional resources for you, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if you haven't yet sent in your questions, please take a moment to do so now. We'll address those next. If you're looking for some books on the startup experience, a couple great books that are easy reads that are also packed with good, useful information. Derek Liddell wrote a book on startup leadership, and Eric Ries, R-I-E-S, he wrote what's considered the startup Bible in many cases. It's called The Lean Startup. Those are two excellent ones. Also, when I send out the slides from today, I'm also going to be including Ellen's list of startup resources in Boston, which is an excellent handout. Please also feel free to contact me with any questions. Here's my email address, and there's a link to my website as well. So with that, why don't we turn, Ellen, to questions that people may have.
Okay, great. Why would people want to pay it forward and have an informational interview with me?
Yeah, so typically networking is not about schmoozing. It's really about a win-win interaction. So networking done right, it actually benefits both parties. So the person who is offering you their time typically is happy to do so because they get something out of it. And something as simple as, feeling like another person is expressing interest in me, that is enough to tickle people's egos, and that gives them something out of the conversation. Everyone loves speaking about themselves. So at its most basic level, you're actually helping people just by showing some interest in them, asking them about their experience. Some people feel good about, paying it forward and helping out others who are perhaps earlier in their career or took a different career path. Maybe there's other ways in the course of your conversation that you might reciprocate in some way, and that might come out during the conversation as well.
And I think another thing to remember is that nobody gets to where they are in life doing it all by themselves in a vacuum. People have conversations, people have mentors, all sorts of varying degrees of relationships with individuals, and people that tend to give back are people that tend to have had really great opportunities for those who sort of came before them. So I think it's also just a natural process.
You're so right, Ellen. That is so true, and it's often overlooked.
Another question. When is kickstarting an idea the right approach versus raising capital?
Yeah, so if you're among perhaps the folks on this call that is considering starting, your own venture, raising capital is really a strategy that you want to fit to your reality. So if you have, for instance, if you've always wanted to start your company because you want to be in control of the business, then kickstarting can be a great approach. So can just simply bootstrapping of finding a customer, making a first sale, taking that income and plowing it back into the business. If you're the kind of person that perhaps is willing to give up control to move faster or to deliver a product in an industry that requires a greater amount of investment to get a minimum viable product out. For instance, healthcare is an industry like that. You might not have the luxury of kickstarting or organically funding the business. It may require a big injection of capital. So it's really a function of finding, what's the right strategy for you? What are your expectations and needs, both in terms of control, in terms of timing, and as well as what kind of resourcing does your product require?
Great. These questions are great. Here's another. How do you assess the culture of a company and the fit through the interview process?
Yeah, that is a good one. And I think we talked a little bit about the 7 startup mindsets. So one way is to have a discussion around those 7 mindsets. How do you think the company is at responding to change? How much change have you had to go through? How have you resourced projects? And see, based on this reflection exercise we talked about earlier, how does that fit with your own understanding of your own preferences? So that's certainly one way to go about it. I think it's also important to have a candid and explicit conversation about what's going to be required in this position. So what are some of the unstated expectations that a hiring manager may have for the person doing this role? Have that conversation and listen to your gut about how that feels. How reasonable is that for you? Have an explicit conversation about the financial situation of the company. So a lot of hiring managers are a little reticent to share that, but they need to, because anybody who's coming into a startup needs to understand the risk that they're taking. So that's another way to get a sense of the culture, is how open the hiring manager is able to be with you about some of the risks.
Great. So this question is, I'm looking to start a company with like-minded MIT alums. How can I meet up with them?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the MIT Enterprise Forum is a great resource. So these are meetings that occur typically with alums, but sometimes even broader, in many different cities as part of the alumni office's way of engaging alums. And they cover a variety of topics that are all related to entrepreneurship in one way or another. So simply going to those events, you'll meet a lot of people. Ellen, isn't there also the Martin Trust Entrepreneurship Center?
Yes. There are lots of various and sundry hives. There's also Start Labs, that's a student-run organization on campus. And on our website, there's a section, if you're interested in those topics, it will direct you to some of the on-campus centers that are doing that. I mean, obviously it's happening in a lot of places, but the most sort of fruitful on-campus locations.
Yeah. In general, going to startup events, you'll meet like-minded people. It also might be worth just engaging with people in your network, folks you used to work with in the past, to see where they are in their career and would they be interested in just, having a blue sky conversation with you about a new product or business and potentially contributing in some way.
Definitely. And in the ICANN that I mentioned earlier, that subsection of the online alumni directory, you could just type in the word startup, and people that have had startup experience, it will search that way, and then you can get more specific and slice that data further, dealing with specific industries or areas geographically. So that might also be a good place to generate some lists.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. How important is it, this is a good one, how important is it to live in a startup hub like Boston or San Francisco Bay Area?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's two ways that I'm hearing that question. So I'm wondering if you're asking as an employee who is interested in working for a startup or as a potential founder of a startup. And of course, there's different answers there. If you're interested in joining a startup, a lot of times companies expect, particularly startups who need to get great talent, they expect that there's going to be some employees who are remote. And as long as you're able to work remotely and perhaps come into the office, monthly, and you're willing to do that travel, a lot of companies are open to that. If you're considering starting a company, I think most of the technical entrepreneurs that I know say that their biggest challenge among everything they're doing in their business is staffing, finding good technical people. And so if you're located in a place, in a location where you've got access to great technical talent, maybe because there's some great universities nearby or there's already sort of an established group of startups, that's kind of like the minimum I think that you need. You can, find, remote employees, but usually you need to have sort of a core set of on-site people that you can then build off of with remote folks. Funding, which tends to be clustered through venture capital and private equity on the coasts and in Boston, San Francisco, and in Austin and the like. You don't need to live in those cities to access those. In fact, even many people in Boston travel out to San Francisco to raise money and vice versa.
Great, and I think we have time for just one more question. If I'm interested in a co-founder or VP position, how do I gauge the right fit between me and the company?
Yeah, so similar to a few questions ago, I think have a conversation about what the needs are that are behind whatever the job description is. So every job description, there's a pain point behind it that's causing the hiring manager to want to fill the position. So if it's a senior leadership position like that, you're probably going to be looking at the CEO, who's the person you're going to work for. So you can ask them, what's the pain that you're going through that requires a CTO? Is it that you've got developers reporting to you? How well is that communication going? How strategic are they? how much are they able to translate the technical details into terms you can understand to get your input and feedback, and how well are they able to translate what you're saying back into technical requirements. So the other thing I think is to have an open, candid conversation with the CEO or whoever the boss would be about how much process they think is needed, how much technical competence is really needed. Do they really need a people person here? For instance, in the VP of engineering role, to help sort of coalesce a team and build a team and make them feel motivated and unified and work together? Is it that there's really a lack of technical competence and you need somebody with greater depth? So that's one way. Another is to also think about what your preferences are and see if between the needs that the company has and your preference about either being a people person or a manager versus just a technical individual contributor, where there's room for a match.
Great. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your expertise in this area. I hope that people will take the opportunity to reach out to you with additional questions. Obviously, I am available as well, and we do have a career guidance program here at the Alumni Office, and you can find us on the Alumni website. And I thank you all for joining us today and hope that you will continue to support these programs and have a wonderful holiday season and best wishes for the new year. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.